Hello and welcome to Building Brand Gravity. My name is Anne Green. I'm CEO at the GNS Integrated Marketing Communications Group. And it's such a treat today because I get to talk to a very, very old friend. Eryc, welcome.
Thanks, Anne. I'm so excited to do this. This is going to be fun.
Yeah. So I know a lot about you and it's been fun catching up, but tell our listeners a little bit about your background and the work that you do today. And that'll be a good entree into the conversation we're going to have, which has a lot to do with the idea of engagement and the pros of it and the challenges of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So today what I do is I help heart-driven leaders, heart-led leaders to cultivate more human-centric workplaces so that people can become the best versions of themselves and we can get better results. And I do that primarily now through speaking and writing and advising. So that's pretty much what I'm doing. I got here through, as many of us, a very circuitous route. But I began really my career working in General Electric, so huge multinational corporation back in the Jack Welch days, back in the both highs and lows of the Jack Welch days. And through that, I really got to develop a lot of different skills. We were encouraged to work in multiple different parts of the business during that time. They invested very heavily in employee development at the time. So for my early career, that was really valuable. So I got to get involved in things like Six Sigma, which was really key because I got interested in all of this sort of data-driven statistical process improvement, and then realized that none of it mattered if you didn't manage the people side of things. So then I got really interested in the people side, in things like change management, and through that, employee engagement, workplace culture, leadership development. So that's how I ended up here doing what I'm doing today.
Before we get into sort of your view and what you've been bringing to the table in your speaking and also writing, I know you just recently published a book that I've been taking a look at called Stop Engaging Employees, which is a very provocative title. I enjoy that. What are the different areas within employee engagement? How have you seen the idea and the practice of employee engagement sort of change over time? And it really only came into the fore as a language and a practice only within the past couple decades, I feel like.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it comes out of it's come to life in really our working lives. It started off in the early '90s. This whole notion of employee engagement, and there was language used at the time to talk about people being harnessed to their work, and some of that still remains in the way that we talk about employee engagement. But I think definitely prior to the '90s, the notion of really what employees are experiencing at work at all was really not really relevant to the business conversation. And I think in the 90s it became, and really through the early 2000s, very much about how do we get people to do stuff, right? And as you know, like that is a key part of managing a business is sometimes people have to do stuff they don't want to do, and how do we accomplish that? But I think the idea of employee engagement has shifted a bit from how do we get people to do stuff to how do we make this a positive experience for everyone? Mm-hmm. And I think where I'm trying to push it is even further, which is to say that the whole purpose of work is for us to become the best versions of ourselves and to flourish as humans. And that's why organizations exist. So I'm trying to push us even further in that human-centric direction and stop looking at it as something we do to people.
Yeah, I was really intrigued in some of your writing when you and I had a catch-up conversation in preparation for this conversation. You talked about having a bit of a personal epiphany. And there's so much discussion about what is the outcome of what we're trying to do in business, both as individuals and collective as organizations. So I have that double consciousness. I am a worker and I am an organizational leader, right? So I'm trying to look at it from both sides. But for many years, the idea of shareholder value was the outcome of business, or, maybe obviously revenue, profit, and things like that. But tell me a little bit about the epiphany you had regarding what the actual end goal might be of the work we do.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is really important, right? Because I think just to get us there, so we talk about Milton Friedman, and that was the purpose of the organization is to maximize shareholder value. That was sort of taken out of context, but also he meant it. And then we get to, I think it was 2018 that the Business Roundtable comes out and says, actually, the purpose of a business is to maximize outcomes for all of its stakeholders. Right? Mm-hmm. So that means communities and suppliers and employees and customers, right? And that shift was pre-pandemic. I think, as you and I discussed, like during the pandemic, things shifted even more. And I think there was a real awakening for a lot of folks, myself included, about what the role of work is, what the role of my job is, and how I think about my contribution there. So that's where we got to this really abysmal term, quiet quitting, right? Which was really just a way of trying to understand that people were recalibrating the role that their job had in their lives, how much space it occupied. Because for a lot of us, and again, speaking from a position of privilege where I could work from here in my home, a lot of us were able to reevaluate and think about how much we were willing to give, how much we were getting, and think about that mutually beneficial relationship between employer and employee. So I think that shifted. And for me personally, a part of that shift was really realizing, you and I have liberal arts backgrounds. Philosophy is sort of in us, and I like to sort of think about the philosophy of business. And I was really thinking about the fact that we, going way back sociologically, we organized as groups of humans to be able to accomplish more and, frankly, just live longer. And so organizations exist to serve us, and we don't exist to serve organizations. Now, it's not to say that there's not a role in our lives for being of service, but that, I think this mindset shift of people come to work every day to serve the organization, I think is really key for leaders, right? And I'm sure you have experience with this. I was saying, no, that's not true, because they are actually whole people with whole lives behind and ahead of them, and I need to sort of find ways for this work experience that we're having together to be a part of that.
Yeah, I love this. It's a really interesting question of like the business flourishing, organizational flourishing, and also human flourishing.
Yeah.
And that question, I mean, this is not to be a detour and something we can talk more about, that there's also much more question about mental health and wellness and engagement in the workplace in ways that would be inconceivable when we had both graduated college and entered the workforce, especially into those kinds of organizations, just absolutely not on the table. But I want to put a pin in that, because I want to go back to this quiet quitting phrase. And I feel a little triggered by it, because 2021 was quite an intense year, I think, for anybody, whether you're a worker, manager, organizational leader. And, I work in the media, so I recognize that trends have to have names. I have great respect for the press in this country, and it's roiling and messy and chaotic at times. But boy, sometimes people get their teeth into a trend and they just won't let it go. And I think a lot of us are trying to understand the Great Resignation, one thing, quiet quitting, another, but what does this actually mean? And I really enjoyed, and I want you to unpack it a little bit more, that the name quiet quitting was really a misnomer for what was actually happening. How do you see of what that dynamic actually was at that time?
Yeah, and I think it's really insightful of you to home in on that, because I do think that there's it's easy to grasp onto that, as you say, just as it's easy to grasp onto notions of generations, which we can talk about later. But these terms really matter, and the words that we choose matter. And quiet quitting was a way of sort of, I think, blaming people, of putting the onus on the people frankly, with the least amount of power in any organization or in society, and saying, oh, they're quietly not doing their jobs, and sort of shaming. And I think what I encountered an article, and I wish I could remember the name of the author to give proper credit, but Sloan Management Review article in which the author referred to it as calibrated contribution. And I found that term really helpful, actually, right? Because it's about calibration, right? It's not about just stopping doing something. It's about saying, what's the right level of me to give to this effort? And that's going to vary by the person, by the situation, by the organization, by the mission. And so I think this idea of how we calibrate our contribution to our jobs, and I always like to distinguish between jobs and work, because I think that those can get messy. And I think a job, the thing that we do to pay our bills, is a different thing from our work, which may be something like our purpose. And I think calibrating how much we give of ourselves to our jobs is really key to our mental health, to our physical health. And I think obviously what we have to recognize too is that there's such an interdependence here, that we know that what we experience in the workplace doesn't just sort of stay in the workplace, right? And so,
and vice versa.
That's right, exactly. And so, if we're burning out in our work, in our jobs, then what impact is that having on our friends, our families, our loved ones, our neighbors, our communities? That really matters too. So I think that this idea of calibration really becomes a sort of social imperative.
Yeah, I do want to pick up on something you just said, and you can let me know if you have an opinion on it, which is these dialogues about generations in the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And right now at my firm and at many firms, we have 4 generations. We have boomers, millennials, Gen Xers. Don't forget us. We're still here. And also Gen Z. I laugh because there are many articles that just ignore us. We're a small generation. What can you do? But, I've been around long enough, and you have too. And I'm particularly interested from your lens, given the kinds of work you've done in, organizational leadership, employee engagement, and things like that over the years. But there are these ongoing discussions and debates about what can be attributed to a generation, and then versus like what might be a life stage, or what might be some other kind of dynamic that's at play between groups and communities of people within an organization. What is your take on where generational thinking is helpful and where it might not be helpful?
Yeah. Thank you for that nuanced question, because I think that's the key to this is nuance, right? And I think I think that generations are a useful shortcut, right? There's certainly that we can use it as a shortcut for a group of people who were born around a certain period of time and may have a certain shared experience, and that's especially helpful when you have something major that happens in a period of time. You can say, oh, these people went through that thing, and I think that can be really useful. I think if you look at if we're going to look at Gen Z, for example, like these are folks who were in some cases in high school during the peak of the pandemic. What did that experience do to them? What lasting impacts is that going to have for them? I think the important thing is to balance out the generational shortcut with the individual human. So, I think like you and I were born around the same time. We experienced a lot of the same things growing up. We were children of 12 years of the Reagan-Bush administration. And, what did that mean for us? How has that impacted us? That is true. But you and I also grew up in very different circumstances, and that matters too. So, what I think, and I think you'll agree that the sociological findings are that things like socioeconomic status and unfortunately in this country, race, have way bigger of an impact than when you were born. And then I think also if we're to take an idea like generations and take it global, it starts to really fall apart quickly, because the experiences I might have had growing up in India would be very different from the experiences I had growing up in the US in the same time period.
So you titled your book very directly, Stop Engaging Employees, and the subtitle is Start Making Work More Human. Start by explaining that title to me.
Yeah, thank you. So and I admit that part of the purpose is to provoke, to get the wait, what do you mean stop engaging employees? Now, so I think just to clear it up, is employee engagement important? It absolutely is. What I meant to say with stop engaging employees is that it's not something we do to someone. That I always say, I don't believe we can make someone be engaged any more than we can make someone fall in love with us. And if you try to make someone fall in love with you, it's creepy. And so I think similarly, yes, trying to make someone become engaged, because I define engagement as this emotional connection and commitment. And I think, and I recognize like a lot of your audience are communicators, and sometimes that word engagement can mean something different to communicators. Often it means we want people to actually read and understand a message that we're sending, right? But I think the idea of being emotionally connected and committed to what I'm doing is what I think about when I think about engagement. And so that's not something you can do to me. What you can do as a leader, and I think this well, is cultivate the conditions in which that's more likely. So the metaphor I always like to use is that leadership is a lot more like gardening than it is like carpentry. So, the carpenter mindset, which is what a lot of folks get taught in business school, which is that you can design and build a workplace culture, is not how humans work, right? But what you can do is practice consistently over time a key set of disciplines like a gardener does to create the conditions in which it's more likely that people are going to flourish and become engaged, develop that condition of engagement. So stopping engaging employees is really about stopping seeing it, doing it something we do to someone, but also that start making work more human piece, which goes hand in hand. It's really also about how do we think about individual human dignity in these often, profit-driven, hierarchical, as you mentioned, organizations. How do we preserve dignity for all in that process? So I think that's a big part of what that's about as well.
It's great. It's funny in business development, with sometimes people talk about gardening or versus hunting, the cultivation
Right.
piece, which is really about, again, cultivating human connection versus like, I want to sell something to you now. But the carpentry piece reminded me of the old phrase. You can say it many different ways, but if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
and that does feel like that rigidity or that structure that organizations can sometimes have. It's like, I need to put everybody in this very specific place and kind of hammer it all into place. And it's hard to avoid that, but it's an interesting concept that you're getting to the heart of, which is engagement is something we do with versus to. Am I understanding that correctly in terms of your perspective?
Yeah, that's exactly. I think we are all together cultivating engaging workplaces. We all want that feeling of emotional connection and commitment and excitement about what we're doing, but we're all creating that together. It's not something that you as a leader design and build and then plug humans into. Right? All those humans contribute.
Yeah, it's true. And you know what? One of the things I was thinking about a lot is that organizational leadership and a relationship between organization and employees is both very collective and yet also very individual. So
Yeah.
I feel this dynamic tension very strongly in my role and have. So leaders want and need to engage with each person as the individual human being they are, or they should want to, at least I do. But they also necessarily need to regard the full staff or the full organism as a collective entity. And sometimes the needs of the many are not aligned with the needs of the one. There's ups and downs in business cycles. Sometimes there's hard times or easier times. How do you think about that tension point between the collective and the individual and that relationship between organizations and staff?
Oh, gosh. I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I've been thinking about it at the sort of larger sociological context of that tension between independence and interdependence. And,
Yeah.
we are both of those. We are both individuals having individual experiences.
Mm-hmm.
No one else knows what's going on in this messed up brain right now. Right. But at the same time, we accomplish nothing solitarily. Right. We are all interconnected and interdependent. And so I think within an organization, I think that shows up exactly as you say, as this tension. When I look at things like, performance management systems and that sort of thing, they're all very individualistic, right? We're evaluating this individual employee's performance over time, and we're trying to isolate that somehow from the interactions that they have with their colleagues and coworkers. And that's really hard to do, especially as organizations are more and more creating value through collaboration, right? Like what you accomplish in your business only happens among people. It doesn't happen because one person does one thing. And so I think this tension is very real. And there's a couple of different things that I think about that are implications of this. So on the one hand, I think there is the individual who has their own unique needs and aspirations and fears and motivations, and they're unique to them. And they have their own sort of life behind and ahead of them. And they come to work with all of that. And then we want to create the conditions in which they become engaged with what we're all trying to do together. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. And I think this is something that I've been having conversations with leaders a lot, which is that I think we've developed this notion that for someone to disengage is inherently bad. And sometimes it's just the way it's going to go. That if what you want me to engage with is something that I don't find engaging, it might be better for us not to work together. And that's a human-centric outcome as well. So I don't think the goal is for everyone in the organization to be engaged necessarily, because I think over time, as the clarity of the mission develops, as we get clearer on what's important to us and what we're trying to accomplish together, there are going to be some of us that are going to say, yeah, that's not really aligned with where I'm headed as an individual. And so that's how I think about that independence, interdependence within the context of an organization. But I do think it's not simple, and I think it's necessary. You know, I want to sort of acknowledge that these the categorization, the affinitization, coming back to like generations, for example, is necessary and helpful. And so, I think within the organization, I think when we talk about, you know, segmentation or personas, right, or avatars, we are kind of creating these fictions, and they're necessary and helpful. And I think within the organization, that's part of how we reconcile individual and collective experience, is by sort of figuring out who are we and what are we up to together. And you mentioned this earlier, that there is no us, them, it's all us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so critical in an organization, to have that big, broad sense of, when we say we mean us all.
You're touching on some really important things, I think, that I see a lot of leaders struggling with, and it's the post-pandemic. Are we post now? I don't know if we are or not, but let's call it post-pandemic. I feel that it's the pandemic really got the highlighter out and just like highlighted everything in bright color, which is, what the heck does it mean to be engaged, and how does one signal or perform that? Is it and how it looks different for different people? And I'll give you another example. So you take an institution that I volunteer for, that you know well as well, our alma mater. We both went to the same college. And one of the discussions we were having about volunteering is that love for an institution might look different for different people. Yeah. For some, love might be critique, as in, I care about this place, so I actually want to speak out and make it better. For others, love may look like, I love it. This is great. Like, I'm all in. And I feel that over time, it was that kind of, I don't want to diminish it by saying rah, rah. Like, if it's authentic, it's, you know, I'm a very hyped person. I'm very enthusiastic. I get very into things. So when I really care about something, I'm into it, right? But yeah, it's a lot easier to see engagement through that lens than someone who may just perform their engagement in a different way, like may not be the one who wants to join everything, may need more time to recharge their battery, doesn't want to come to all the things. Or it could be someone who's like, I want us to do better. I care about this place enough to want to do better. And I feel people really trying to understand this more now, to say, what, especially in a hybrid environment or remote environment, what does engagement look like? And can it look different for different people? Do you have opinions on this? Because to me, I think it's a really important set of questions.
Yeah, it really is. And I think the way that you've stated it is so respectful of kind of that spectrum of what does exist and what engagement might look like. And I love the idea of, how am I performing my engagement? I think that's a really good way to describe it, because I think that the tendency is to say an engaged employee looks like this. And if a person doesn't look like this, then they're not engaged. And there's sort of good reasons why we go there, right? We do, it is something that we want to keep track of. It's often a KPI in the organization to keep track of employee engagement scores and what have you. And so we are trying to establish some kind of standard or measurement of what it means to be engaged. But I think engaged can look a lot of different ways. And I think part of trying to be an inclusive workplace is trying to recognize too that people can show up in a lot of different ways, and we don't know what the internal state is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting observations, and helpful to just think through, as you said earlier, calibrating. How are people calibrating work and life? For years, this phrase work-life balance has, I think, been such a joke. You know, let's call it what it is. I mean, don't mean to be rude, but the idea, and as you said, Eryc, words matter. So work-life balance implies there is a perfection, that there's a balance. Balance means that you found the point where it's going to be fixed and stay. It'll stay perfectly balanced there. And we all know that that's not how life is or work is. And so the idea that there may be a calibration relative to your enjoyment of your work, or the bonding or the alignment with the organization, or what's happening in your life. I mean, I think these are very realistic and thoughtful things that leaders need to understand and be open to. continue to contemplate, because I also don't find it to be a fixed medium. I think it's shifting all the time. Individuals are shifting. We as people are evolving all the time. I mean, would you agree with that? It changes constantly.
Well, I think that's exactly what I love about what you just hit on, which is that these are ongoing actions. And so I actually used to write and speak quite a bit about work-life balance, but I would always say it's a verb. It's not a state of being.
Yeah.
Right? That we are work-life balancing all the time. Right. That's kind of how things work, you know. And if you're on a balance beam, you know that you're constantly making micro adjustments, right, to stay balanced. And I think that's what we're actually doing when we're trying to maintain work-life balance. We don't maintain it at all. We're just sort of constantly making active micro adjustments. We're actively doing it, right? And so I think that's also, acknowledging the sort of macro environment in which organizations are operating today, which is, as people like to say, VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I like to add to that emergent, right? That there are outcomes that come out of organizations that we didn't even know were coming, right? So, operating in that environment versus operating in a stable, predictable environment of maybe 50, 100 years ago, it's just going to look different. And so there is a nimbleness, an activeness to how we all are trying to navigate these things. And that means we can show up differently every day.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just speaking about my least favorite acronym VUCA earlier today in a town hall meeting. Right. So now I can call it VUCA-E, the emergent. I like that. No, we're in a VUCA world. It's the VUCA world. We just live in it. I think that's very true. And that has huge implications for organizations and their workforce as people, as a community. Lack of that constant instability or the question, the uncertainty, it infuses the atmosphere. So in your book, you have a number of E's. Mm-hmm. Was it 6 E's?
6 E's, yep, that's right.
Yeah, but tell me a little bit about, obviously I encourage folks to check you out, find the book. I think there's a lot of good thinking in here as they're hearing already. But what are some of the most critical lenses or takeaways or pieces that you'd want to share as you summarize this work for others?
Yeah, so I think and I appreciate the question. I think these 6 E's are intended not to make a leader's job harder, because I recognize that your job is already hard enough. But they're intended to bring to consciousness disciplines that you're weaving through how you're doing your work. And so, and the most important one, I think, if I had to pick one of the 6, is the first one, which is empathize. Mm-hmm. And this is what a lot of our discussion has been about today, right? Which is really about understanding who people are in the workplace, what their needs and aspirations and fears and motivations are, what they're excited about, what they're scared of, right? And understanding that at that individual level is a necessary precondition to anything else we try to do to create a human-centric workplace. If we don't start with understanding who our fellow humans are in the workplace, we don't stand to work together to cultivate that human-centric workplace. And it's very similar to, when you look outside the organization and you look at understanding your clients, right? Or look at understanding the recipient of a message, right? If we don't understand them, then we're just pushing things as opposed to doing things together. So empathize is definitely the place where I recommend starting. And it's also not as hard as I think I make it sound, because it's really just about one of the pieces of advice I give at the end of a lot of my talks is just start to adjust your speaking to listening ratio. Just start to think about that. I use a tool online called Fathom. Have you used Fathom?
No, I haven't.
It's not an endorsement. It's a tool that I use, and it records conversations and then generates AI notes and follow-up items and all that great stuff. But another thing that it does for the person who's running it is it tells me what percentage of the time I'm speaking. Now, in this context, I'm supposed to be speaking most of the time, and that's fine. But in a conversation, it's really useful. And I think as a leader, it would be great if we had this sort of meter to keep an eye on. How much are we dominating the conversation versus how much are we listening? And again, that's not to shame anyone, but it's just really to say, like, a lot of what leaders are expected to do is have the answers and say all the things. But as we start to adjust that ratio to where we're listening more, then our level of empathy goes up, which enables us to then do things like enable people to do their jobs. Make sure that that's one of those 6 E's is enable. Make sure people have the knowledge, the tools, the skills, the resources they need to do what we're asking them to do. And the thing that I always like to say about enable is every organization wants to raise the bar, but I think we also need to raise the floor. And we raise the floor by just equipping people. Right? So that's enable, and then empower follows that, right? Which is really how do we make sure that we're getting obstacles out of the way, removing friction, things that are preventing or making it harder for folks to do what we want them to do and to become who they want to become. So all of that, we can't do any of that if we haven't done the listening and the empathizing first.
I love the listening piece, and that tool would be a very eye-opening situation for me, especially, and others. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of us who are excited and love to chat and talk and have ideas, and it can come from a good place. But I love what you're saying though about empathy and how to build that and empathize as an active. You could have said empathy, but you said empathize, and I assume that's very deliberate on your part. But it reminds me, as we have our own process here of trying to be more inclusive, of looking at diversity and equity and inclusion and thinking about that very deeply and not moving away from that at all. Yeah. But inclusivity, creating that sense of belonging, creating more psychological safety. I think the idea of empathy, we talk about building trust. When one builds trust, you can remove friction. People don't spend as much time being like, what are they actually saying behind the words that are coming out of their mouths, and wondering about things. So it's just a helpful reminder of simple ways to raise that empathy quotient and be more engaged with folks.
I'm glad. Well, and I think just adding to that, I think there's a couple of things that come up for me. So a lot of times in organizations that I speak to, want their employees to be more empathetic toward their clients. Right. Want them to exhibit empathy for their clients. And so, I get folks coming to me for advice on how do we make our employees be more empathetic, right? And my first question back is, how are you showing them empathy? Right? How are you creating this environment in which empathy is an expectation, in which trying to meet others' needs is an expectation? Because if it's not there internally, it's not going to show up externally either. And the other thing that I want to pick up on that you said, during the pandemic, a lot of folks were trying to figure out how they could keep tabs on employees. Right? That part of the shift to remote and hybrid work was how do we track what folks are doing? My sister-in-law literally had an alarm that would go off on her supervisor's computer if her mouse didn't move in a 10-minute period of time.
Wow.
It's absurd, right? It doesn't actually demonstrate any kind of value. It was just a crutch that folks developed. And I think when we think about how do we equip and enable folks to be successful, we shift to this idea of backing them instead of tracking them, right? To really saying, these people that we've invited into our organization, how do we make sure they have what they need, versus how do we really create this atmosphere of distrust where we think, well, you're probably not working. So what tools can we put in place to keep track of you? So I think that shift, and you highlighted that, but I think that shift is really a key mindset shift that shows empathy.
Well, and it reminds me over the years, because our work career life has spanned a lot of organizational change. Just going back to the idea that it would have been impossible to wear jeans, in the first 10 years of my career, but the .com boom kind of changed that one. But one of the things that I remember saying over time is we have to distinguish between a policy issue and a personnel issue, meaning that, okay, we're going to maybe put, even before the pandemic, remote work opportunities becoming more norm, certainly was for us. Yeah. And the question of, okay, you get this a fear-based mindset that can happen in business and management of, well, what are people doing, right? Mm-hmm. But one thing, and sometimes you put policies in place that just aren't good, or they don't work, or they're not right for everybody. And you feel that the anxiety rises, like you just see their issues, right? So then it's a policy issue. But if you believe in the policy, My attitude is like, watch for the individual issues. And that's a personnel thing where you're working one-on-one with a person who may be struggling in their own way or may not be a fit or something like that. So
That's right.
I think those are sort of these normal push and pulls of management, especially from, and that's maybe where the generations fit, where other ways of working from earlier times kind of pull at your set of norms and expectations. And it's been a real change and challenge these past 5 to 10 years for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that, I think you're absolutely right, because I think there is the what we see in generations. First of all, we see age and stage, right? We see where somebody is in their life, but we also do see how society changes over time, and I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I had a boss back in my GE days. I had a boss who was of an older generation, and every time I came to him with a, having identified something that wasn't working, something that was harder than it needed to be, or he would say, "That's why they call it work."
Yeah. That's an old one. It's an oldie, but a goodie.
It's an oldie and a baddie. It's,
exactly.
But it really conveys this notion that, like, well, work is hard and bad. So let's just deal with that, right? And I think where we are now is not at that assumption at all, right? The assumption is not at all that work is hard and bad, right? It's rather that work is a human activity. Work is something that we do as part of our expression of who we are, and I think that is a shift that we see, and we can look to the younger generations as bellwethers, right, of the shift that is happening. It's not because of them, but they are indicators of what's happening.
I always joke that I try not to live in a Dilbert cartoon. Dilbert was written just like the movie Office Space, under the assumption that all management is the worst, all work is terrible, all organizations are dysfunctional. And I'm like, well, it all depends on how we all show up. We have to make a lot of choices and good choices in management, but I try to avoid having a Dilbert lens, like on my work. Right. I want to feel more empowered than that. But I want to switch gears a little bit. I know you're doing a lot of keynoting, and that's exciting, and a lot of speaking. And one of the things, speaking of engagement, that you're doing that's a bit different is you've told me that you're combining a couple of your passions, one of which is DJing with speaking. That's and right. As someone who does a lot of presentation and speech coaching and presentation skills, I really love that concept. So what made you think of this, and what did it unlock for your audience in combining those two modes?
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. Yeah. So DJing is something that I've done for a lot of years. It was something that I dreamed of doing when I was younger, and then came to quite, relatively late in life for being a DJ, but I've been doing it for a couple decades now. And it's something that I have come to love the experience of helping to cultivate, again, an experience for people. And when I can help to facilitate a party as the DJ, it's incredibly rewarding. And I also have that same sort of sense of fulfillment when I'm speaking and I feel like the message is really connecting and helping people. And when I see a face light up, when I see an aha happen in the room, I get that same sense of fulfillment. And so bringing those two things together was both an attempt to feel more whole myself, right? Just to integrate myself, but also to find a way to convey these messages about leadership in a way that disrupts the way that people are used to receiving those kinds of messages, and that creates a collective experience that's different from the experience we often have when we're all sitting in a hotel ballroom together. And so what I'm doing, I call this talk "Be a Party Rockin' Leader." And what I've done is I've gone through these 6 E's. We've discussed a few of the E's today. I've gone through these 6 E's and said, how do those show up for me as a DJ? And it turns out a lot. Right? Being a DJ who really gets a party going requires great empathy. It requires knowing, what kind of party is this? Is this a quiet after work happy hour, or is this an after hours rager? What are the kinds of songs that get people on the dance floor? What are the songs that clear the dance floor? Taking requests from people, noting what people are responding to. These are things that a great DJ does to get the party going. And as you know, these are also things that a great leader does. Right? As a great leader does not show up and sort of inflict their mission on the organization and on the people in it. And a great DJ doesn't show up and play just the music that they want to play. Right? So now I'm doing this thing where I'm speaking about essentially these same 6 E's, but at the same time DJing to kind of illustrate and create a dance party. So it's about two parts keynote, 1 part dance party, I would say.
What's the reaction from the audience or from the listeners? Because you're right. I've been in many a ballroom listening to keynotes. I have been the keynote in the ballroom. Yeah. What's been the reaction when you've done this?
Yeah, well, my first time doing it, I was aware of what I was up against. That folks had been in the room all day. Actually, it had been a 2-day event. They were tired. They'd been talked at for quite a bit, even though it was a pretty well-run event. And to get up in this, fluorescently lit hotel ballroom and try to transform it into a dance club for a minute, I knew I was up against it. So I just recruited the folks in the audience to be a part of it with me. So I got up there and I said, look, I know where we are. I know what this room looks like. What can we do together to transform this into a dance club for a minute? And somebody got up and turned off the lights, and folks got up out of their seats. And to be clear, not everyone. This is not everybody's vibe. But the majority of the room was up out of their seats when I put on the first song. Before I even started speaking, I just put on a song and got folks dancing. And they were up. They formed a spontaneous conga line around the ballroom. Folks jumped up on the platform with me, sort of completely violating the sanctity of that space, and got up there and were dancing with me. And when the song was over, they went back to their seats, and I started speaking, and they were with me. And so the response has been overwhelmingly positive. My best and favorite piece of negative feedback was, he did a great job. It just wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
Which is great. It's not for everybody.
Which is going to be a percentage of the audience anyway, no matter what.
No matter what. But I feel like what it does for the audience is it not only creates I was reminded of this term, collective effervescence, right? It creates this experience of collective effervescence, that we're all having an experience together that's outside of our usual. That is outside of even what we've come to expect in the past 2 days in this room, right? And it hopefully, my hope is that it then enables people to not only just take what they've heard and learn from me, but actually to remember it and start to integrate it, be more energized to start to integrate it into their lives, because they're thinking about that feeling that they had when they learned.
Well, and that feeling, it brings it back to, what does it mean to feel attached to work or an organization, or to feel a mission, or to feel a part of something, to enjoy moments with colleagues, whether they're virtual or right in front of you. I mean, I think that's a beautiful way to put it, to kind of come full circle. But I'll ask you my final question of the podcast, which I always like to ask. So it's called Building Brand Gravity, core theme. So what is a business or a brand or some aspect of culture that has you in its gravity right now, Eryc?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Wow. I think one thing that I'm really excited about right now is actually relating to DJing. So there's a company out there. I actually don't know who the parent company is, but they own a couple of different DJ sort of equipment companies, and part of what they're trying to do is really democratize DJing. So they're creating DJ controllers and things that are really meant for people who just want to do it as a hobby. And obviously I do it as more than a hobby, but I love that what they are doing is saying everyone can be a DJ. And we're going to equip you to DJ in your living room, to DJ in your bedroom, to DJ for your friends, at your little New Year's Eve party in your apartment. And I love, so they're called Newmark. And what they do really speaks to me, because it's really enabling people and empowering people to pursue a thing that they may have thought was out of reach.
I love it. That's a great answer. Well, Eryc Eyl, thank you so much for joining us on Building Brand Gravity. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Anne. This has been really fun, and let's talk soon.
All right.